Right now, we're going to welcome our next live guest, our director of FreightWaves Academy, Scott Berhang, with us today and talking all about what's going on with fuel prices and the oil market right now as the U.S. bans imports of Russian oil. Scott, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, welcome. Yeah, we got you, Scott. It's nice to talk to you again, my friend. I haven't spoken to you in quite some time. Let's talk about what's going on here. Yeah, it has. Let's talk about what's going on here with the fuel here in the U.S. and the impacts from the Russian oil imports. Now we've now banned those, right? So is it a significant amount that we bring in? What is the amount that we bring in, and how is this going to really impact those fuel prices?
Sure. So, it's a somewhat small amount of the total global crude oil, that we bring into the United States. I think it has a huge psychological impact on the market. I think what's important to understand is that a lot of what drives local fuel prices, which is what impacts truckers, is what I call the price influence chain. Okay, and the price influence chain is it begins with the futures market. It then affects bulk prices in the major refining hubs, which are spot markets. It then carries down to the local level, which is what we call the rack, which is where most carriers get their fuel from. Okay, so I think it is a realistic problem, but it's also what we like to refer to in the PRA world as a bit of a psychological impact on the market. Right now, I don't think, we're not seeing supply outages anywhere, but what you're seeing is a price reaction because of that fuel price influence chain that I was talking about. And when those prices go higher, it's a chain that drives everything up, with retail being the final piece of it.
So, Scott, that retail component is something that's really important, and it's what all of our consumers, not only just our truck drivers, are seeing, and their reaction is also part of that psychological component as well. When you're talking about the fuel retailers who ultimately set the price at the pump, right? They're the ones who decide what they're going to flash up on their little sign and what the consumer is going to pay them to get that gas in their tank. Can you talk about how the general consumer reaction is impacting those retailers and what they're seeing, and what type of choices they're choosing to make when it comes to the prices that they're asking us to pay?
Well, okay, so retail markets in the U.S. are very complicated. It's not just as simple as somebody changing the price on the station. It depends on what kind of retailer you are, right? So if you own your own station, then yes, you do set the price, and you set the price based on the competition. If you're what we call a direct dealer, meaning that you're supplied by somebody else, they kind of tell you what the price has to be. But in any case, when you start getting to what I call the psychological break point of pricing, which for diesel fuel is $5 a gallon, and we're getting pretty close to it, you begin to really impact people's business, and it trickles down, obviously, right? You have to pay more for the fuel in your truck. It costs more to ship goods. That trickles down to everybody. I think retailers, and I've got a lot of years of experience with retailers, are very sensitive to market conditions, and the last thing anyone wants to do in this situation we're in right now is to be accused of price gouging or trying to take advantage of a situation. I think they're responding to the market. They want to keep up with the competition, and if the competition is raising their price, they're going to try to raise it as well. They're going to follow what's going on. So it's a ripple effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And we've got a chart here. Hopefully they can pull this up here. Scott, we want to get into some of the effects and whether you're an enterprise type carrier or not, an owner operator, that type of smaller fleets that maybe don't have some of these contracts, and what those effects are. What you're looking at here really is the blue and the orange line there. The blue line is contracted rates, right? Rate per mile without fuel included. The orange line there is your spot rates. It does include fuel. But the green line here that we're looking at there's your DOE, and you can see that the retail, and this is your retail price for for diesel, and you can see that, you know, just exploding, right? Just taking off that huge hockey stick that is getting there. And that's really, there's a function that happens there, and it's different for both the enterprise and the what I would call the spot market type of carrier, right? Can you speak to that a little bit and how those smaller carriers can help themselves through this, or even the enterprise?
Well, that's a really good question. So, you know, what you have to sort of understand is that in the fuel world, the size of the bat you swing, meaning the rate of your ratability, meaning how much fuel you purchase on a monthly basis or an annual basis, kind of dictates the kinds of deals that you get, right? So the bigger carriers that, you know, consume copious amounts of fuel, when they negotiate their deals with their suppliers, they are able to leverage their volumes and they're able to get a better deal. So they're not paying rack, they're paying something substantially below rack. The other thing that I think is important to understand is that for most of these very large enterprise people that you're talking about, they also hedge. Okay, and hedging is when you use a financial instrument to offset volatility in the raw price of your commodity. So there's a lot of folks who are bigger who get both of those benefits. They get the benefit of buying a lot of fuel, they get a better deal, and they also hedge. If you're a small guy, if you're the person who owns, you know, 1, 2, or 3 trucks and you fuel over the road, those are the people that are going to be hurt by this because they don't have the leverage. Now, one of the things that they can look at doing is try to investigate what we call fleet card companies, where you can contract with a credit card company and you try to negotiate something that's called cost plus. Okay, so cost is going to be my rack price. It's going to be all my other laden incidental costs that get me, at the end of the day, it gets me below a retail price. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. But again, I have to stress that for everybody that's watching, the more volume you have in terms of the fuel that you buy, the more leverage you're going to have to try to get a better deal. But the reality is that if you're that guy who's, you know, a real small company, maybe they have 1 or 2 trucks. I used to have customers like this when I worked at Opus for many years. You know, you're kind of at the mercy of the market with people like that. But I always tell people that in these kinds of situations like we're in right now, where you have retail prices going up, you have wholesale prices for fuel going up, this is the time to go back and look at what kind of deal you have with your supplier. Read your contract. Look at what your volumes are, because with a lot of folks, they did a fuel contract 5 years ago, maybe their business has doubled and they're buying twice as much fuel, but they're not leveraging that with their supplier, and maybe look around for different suppliers. Does that help?
Yeah, it absolutely does.
Scott, you mentioned right now that we're not seeing true shortages in commodities right now, and that shortage and that panic buying kind of ideal isn't necessarily what's helping to drive up that price. Do you see that there being a threat of there being shortages in the future if we don't step up domestic production to meet the shortage of what we're losing from Russian imports, if it truly is that big of a piece? And then the follow-up to that, is there any type of strategy that folks can implement to where you're both maximizing your ability to save on your fuel costs, but without running up a shortage or causing a panic situation?
Sure. So to answer your first question, you know, what I think people don't understand about the U.S. supply system is that it is a very highly complex infrastructure. It's refineries, it's pipelines, it's terminals that are on pipelines, or they're on rail, or they're on the water, or whatever. But I point this out because that infrastructure is aging and it's prone to problems. So I don't know if your viewers remember from a little while ago, Colonial Pipeline, which is the largest pipeline carrier in the United States, had to shut down because of technical problems, and there were outages everywhere. You know, we're not really seeing that right now, so product is still flowing in, and you're getting there. I mean, I think if we do make up for the Russian crude oil imports, if we do find a way to make that up, whether it's through Venezuelan imports or whether we release more from the government, I don't, without a structural issue, I think we look like we're pretty good. Um, but it's going to be a situation where it's highly volatile. It's a moving target. Prices are going up. What I would say is the thing to beware of, and it's a great way to keep on top of the market. If you're a large fuel buyer, read the news, understand what's going on, because if there's an infrastructure problem, now you have two problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have problem number one, which is the psychological impact of this horrible war that's going on, and you have an actual problem. So that could create mayhem. We're not there yet, and I'm not saying that that's what's happening. But if you take a refinery out of the picture, or if there's some type of issue with a distribution system, that could cause a lot of problems on top of what's already going on. To answer, and I'm sorry, what was your second question?
My second question was if there were any strategies to kind of maximize your cost savings while also preventing, a run up on purchasing or by creating that buying panic.
Yeah, well, it kind of goes back to what I said before. So I'm a huge advocate of constantly looking at the way you buy fuel, because you've got two situations that happen, right? On one side, you've got your business that's probably changing. It's either growing or maybe it's not growing or it's getting smaller. So you have that issue. And then once you see what your volumes are and how you're buying fuel now, you can always look at doing it differently. There are other ways to do it, especially if you have that ratability. Ratability is king in the fuel buying world. And just for all of our viewers who might be confused on what I mean by ratability, ratability is the amount of fuel that you buy. Okay, and it's looked at usually monthly or annually. And I think it's a great time for people, whether they're buying 500 million gallons of diesel fuel a year, or whether it's a small guy that's buying, 5 million or 10 million. You can always look at the way you're buying fuel, and you can always try to give it a haircut. See if there's other ways to do it. I don't, for a lot of people, one of the ways to get around this is to have a bulk tank on their plant, where they buy a lot of fuel and they have it delivered. So that is one way to do it, but that's really whether you have the ability to do that. Then you also have some price risk doing that, because you're buying big quantities of fuel in a market that could see prices going lower. You know what I mean? So it's always a good idea to go back, look at your existing contract, look at the relationships that you have with your suppliers. Are you buying over the road, or are you buying on a card, or what are you doing? And try to really review it with your internal team and see if there are ways to leverage your ratability to try to cut some of that base cost off. And that will help you as the retail prices go up.
Scott, one more question before we let you go today. When it comes to increasing domestic production, it's not as easy as just flipping a switch and getting more oil out of the ground, which I think a lot of folks in the general public kind of think, right? There's a lot of barriers to entry when it comes to stepping up domestic production. And those barriers also include a lot of what we're seeing right now in just the general supply chain. You've got supply shortages, you've got material shortages, you have labor shortages to ramp up that domestic supply chain production, you have transportation issues to get commodities from point A to point B. Can you just touch a little bit quickly on what some steps would needed to be taken to slowly and incrementally increase domestic production, and if that increase could happen in a fashion where it would be enough to sustain us during this time where we can't, or where we would have to find a secondary source?
Well, so that's a complicated question. I think, again, going back to what I said before, this is a bit of an aging infrastructure. Also complicating it is very complicated fuel specs around the United States. Okay, so we are required to use cleaner burning fuel. When I first started in the business, diesel fuel was diesel fuel, right? Now you have all kinds of different diesel fuels and gasolines that are required throughout the United States. So that taxes the system. So it's not just like we can say, flip a switch and go from 80% of capacity to 100% of capacity. It just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. I think what you will probably see is a concerted effort to diminish what we call a turnaround season. Okay, so we are heading into what is called a refinery turnaround season. It happens in the spring and it happens in the fall. And a turnaround is scheduled maintenance on a refinery, and it can be anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months, depending upon what it is that they're doing. So I think one of the things you may start to see is some of these planned turnarounds that will be coming up in the next 8 to 12 weeks. Maybe they'll push them off a little bit with the hope that this situation will calm down and they can increase production. Or if not being able to increase production, not lose any more production. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, you mentioned before. I mean, there isn't a shortage of oil right now. There isn't a shortage of diesel. It is a fear based on the sanctions that are there, and will we be able to ramp that up in our own production or get it from Venezuela, right? So if you're moving forward, wouldn't it make more sense rather than urging higher production from the oil companies to maybe suggest some policies that would make the U.S. less oil dependent on other companies, and wouldn't that cause speculators to view it as a positive?
Wow. Okay. That's complicated.
But I mean, these are the things that people ask, right? I mean, these are the things.
Yeah,
when you start talking about ramping up in production, oil goes down. It's not high because there's no oil. It's high because speculators are fearful that it will go and trying to take advantage of prices going up.
That's the pivotal thing. So when I said at the beginning that a lot of the movement in these markets is psychological, that's the truth. So, futures markets are very, very volatile. Okay, so the less dependent we become on foreign oil, the better.
I don't know if we lost Nora.
Understandable. All right, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. You're going to be on Loaded and Rolling with Thomas Wasson coming up next week, talking fuel once again. So we'll catch you on Monday afternoon right here on FreightWaves TV.
I'm looking forward to it. It was a pleasure being with you guys.
Right on. Thanks, Scott.